Hi there, and welcome to this AP Environmental Science video. This video is about coffee. Well, not really. It's about sustainable agriculture. But sustainable agriculture has to do with coffee. And in fact, a big reason that we have the coffee that we have today is because of sustainable agriculture. I love drinking coffee, and I want to get back to that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about what this video is really about. Really, the goal of this video is how we can increase crop yields in a sustainable manner. And there's going to be two major learning goals of this video. The first is I want you to explain the objectives of sustainable agriculture practices. And second, I want to be able to describe the goals and techniques of integrated pest management. So let's talk about sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is going to fulfill the needs for food and fiber while enhancing soil quality, minimizing the use of non-renewable resources. Let's get that all on the screen there. Minimizing the use of non-renewable resources, and allowing economic viability for farmers. A key step to achieving this is soil conservation. The idea of soil conservation is that we need to prevent soil erosion while increasing soil depth and increasing nutrients and organic matter. In order for sustainable agriculture to work, there's two major requirements. First is that sustainable agriculture generally requires more labor and cost. And second, sustainable agriculture is going to allow more land to be productive long term. One of those is a bit of a restriction, labor and cost. The other is certainly a benefit. Let's look at some traditional methods of sustainable farming. Down here, we have a picture of them, and then we can talk about some definitions. Some traditional methods of sustainable farming include the idea of agroforestry. Agroforestry can be described as planting vegetation in a windbreak to prevent wind and soil erosion. Those graphics on the text on the screen. There we go. We can also talk about strip cropping. Strip cropping is a form of intercropping that uses different spacing and rooting characteristics to also prevent soil erosion. Depending on the contour of the land, different strategies might be more appropriate for different contours or different locations. Contour plowing occurs when plowing and harvesting parallel to the topography and the contours of the land. You can see a picture of contour plowing right over here on the graphic. And finally, we have terracing. Terracing is when farms shape sloping land into flat, step-like terraces. This will allow for previously unusable land on a slope to now be useful agricultural land. Some modern sustainable farming techniques expand upon what we talked about earlier. One modern technique that I'd like to start with is the idea of perennial plants. Perennial plants are plants that live for multiple years and do not need to be replanted each season. And I think you can imagine that if we're planting our crops only once and not over and over, that's going to require less energy, fewer fertilizers, less impact on the land. We also have been exploring as a modern technique no-till agriculture. No-till agriculture occurs when annual cropland that is not tilled or plowed between seasons. Some farmers are experimenting with green manure. This is plant material grown with the intention of plowing it under at the end of the season, crops that are not intended to be sold or used for other purposes. Limestone is one really good example of modern sustainable agriculture techniques. And limestone, or calcium carbonate, is a sedimentary rock that's been crushed up and ground up and can be used as a fertilizer, can increase the cation capacity or the cation concentrations in your soil. And finally, there's rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is rotating farm animals to different pastures and fields so that overgrazing doesn't occur. One other method of sustainable agriculture is the idea of organic agriculture. And perhaps you've heard about organic agriculture at a local farmer's market, maybe right here in East Hampton or in Northampton. Organic agriculture is the practice of using the production of crops to sustain or improve the soil without using synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. Can add that right there. In speaking a little bit more about organic agriculture, there's certain facets that define something as organic agriculture, and I'll list those down below here. Organic agriculture uses natural or ecological systems. It helps to increase soil mass, organic matter, and biological activity. Organic agriculture retains as much organic matter and nutrients in the soil as possible. Again, it avoids the use of synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, and it reduces adverse environmental effects of agriculture, again, by sort of minimizing the impact of that agriculture. One bit of legislation that I'd like to touch on here is what's called the Delaney Clause. The Delaney Clause in the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act is designed to prevent potentially harmful cancer-causing food ingredients from entering into the food supply. And that's going to be a really important legislative advance in terms of agriculture and food production. But let's get back to that shade-grown coffee now, because that's something I would really like to talk about here. Here's some pictures of shade-grown coffee. And to talk a little bit about it, coffee is a small understory tree or shrub. Traditionally, it's been grown amongst forests in the shade. Various studies indicate that Arabica coffee has highest yields in somewhere between 35 and 65% shade. So growing coffee under shade discourages weed growth. Weeds require a lot of light, and if you grow in the shade, you don't get a whole lot of that light. Also, it may reduce pathogen infection. Growing in the shade helps to protect the crop from frost. Oftentimes there's a little bit of an insulating effect there. And finally, helping to increase the number of pollinators that are attracted to that coffee. Coffee grown in the shade takes a little bit longer to ripen, which contributes to complex flavors in the coffee. So that's one of the advantages of shade-grown coffee. However, let's balance that out then by saying that in sunnier conditions, let me get it on the screen here, in sunnier conditions, well, that's going to produce faster and higher yields. Also, sun is going to help prevent the spread of what's called coffee leaf rust, which is a pest. And finally, fewer shade trees and coffee plantations decreases biodiversity, which would be a downside of sun-grown coffee. So coffee producers need to weigh these benefits, these pros and cons, when deciding how to grow their coffee. And we've got a nice graphic here that's going to help to summarize those pros and cons. Sun-grown coffee, again, it grows a whole lot faster. Does require more water, fertilizer, and pesticides. There's less biodiversity, and it does degrade the ecosystem. Shade-grown coffee, it grows a little bit slower, and think about the economic consequences of that. However, it requires less water, fertilizer, and pesticides, supports greater biodiversity. So, like with all things in this course, we need to weigh the economic and the ecological cost and benefit. And as a consumer, you can directly influence this. When you go to the store, you can pick buying shade-grown coffee or traditional sun-grown coffee. The next thing I'd like to talk about in this video is the idea of integrated pest management. Again, our goal here is to increase yield in a sustainable manner. I want to rewrite that to be sure we're remembering it. Integrated pest management is going to use a variety of techniques to control pest species while minimizing pesticide inputs into the environment and, again, increasing agricultural output. The idea here is we can always add more pesticides, but maybe that's not the best thing to do. Maybe we're going to develop pesticide resistance. Maybe there's adverse health consequences. So if we can find ways to minimize pesticide or level pesticide use while also getting the benefits of reduced pests, that's the goal of integrated pest management. There's going to be three facets of integrated pest management we want to look at. First is crop rotation. Second are what are called biocontrols. And third, we're going to look at minimal pesticide controls. So I first want to look at crop rotation. Crop rotation is a planting strategy where different types of crops are planted, different types of crop species are planted from season to season on the same plot of land. What this is going to allow is this is going to prevent pests from getting used to one crop, and it's going to prevent crop-specific diseases from settling in. I think you can imagine if you had the same crops year after year, pests would have a reliable food source, and that might help those pests to thrive, which would then force you to use more pesticides. You also have the idea of intercropping. Intercropping is a strategy allowing for spacing crops growing at the same time to promote biological interactions. Maybe you've got crops that are mutually beneficial for one another, and by planting them near each other, you encourage growth. Again, in this situation, another example might be one crop could attract insect predators for another crop. So rather than needing to use artificial pesticides or synthetic pesticides, we can attract a predator. And that might be a really effective way of preventing pests. The third strategy I mentioned for integrated pest management is the idea of biocontrols. And biocontrols allow biological factors to control agricultural pests. Let me put that up as a definition. Biological factors to control agricultural pests. Typically, this involves introducing a species that will consume the pest eating the crop. And before you do this, though, studies have to be conducted in order to ensure the introduced species will consume the correct pests and won't consume other species living in the area. Finally, you might benefit from having natural predators in the area. And these are predators that occur naturally with the area anyway and would be beneficial for integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is typically used in small amounts if pests remain after other steps in the IPM are exhausted. And here we see a good graphic showing that. See if I can get that on the screen there. Where again, if we're looking at the number of pesticide applications before using integrated pest management, pesticide use was quite high, whereas afterwards pesticide use was quite a bit lower. And you can imagine if there's health consequences of that pesticide use or environmental consequences, this would be beneficial. We can also look at harvest yields. And before integrated pest management, yields were a little bit lower. After integrated pest management, this is not changing the crops you're using necessarily, but using either natural predators or a biocontrol, crop rotation, or intercropping, the yields were increased. And that might be both a sustainable and an economic method for increasing crop yields. As one final option that I want to end on here, perhaps the best way to pursue sustainable agriculture is to get back to basics, to mimic the way the natural ecosystem functions. Ecosystems naturally operate in cycles and are internally stabilized with negative feedback loops. In this way, they provide a useful model for agriculture. And we see here a natural method for rice production, natural rice producing ecosystem. And that rice doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in the presence of ducks that might provide some fertilizer waste or oxygenate the water. Rice exists in the presence of other crops that add nitrogen to the soil, or fish that can deal with waste or provide more waste resources to that rice. So by trying to mimic these natural ecosystems, we also can perhaps produce a sustainable, higher yield crop. But this requires perhaps more time, more labor, and perhaps is not as efficient as industrial scale monocropping. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And I hope at the end of it, you can confidently talk about two different learning goals. You can talk about techniques and goals for integrated pest management and explain the objectives of sustainable agriculture practices. Thanks for watching.